Good morning. Today I'll be discussing about OAuth and OpenID Connect from a privacy point of view. More specifically, I'll be talking about a model which implements better privacy protection methods over the existing protocol. So we'll start from how it was in the past to where we are now. Then we'll go across some terms which we'll be needing to understand the rest of the slides. Then OAuth and OpenID Connect, then finally to our model, which is Privacy Protecting OpenID Connect. So initially, when the web just came along, service on the web wanted personalized content for the user. So the service would create an account with a username and password, and the user would have to log in with his password, and he would get personalized services. But the problem was, as more and more services started to pop up, he needed to store more passwords and he needed to remember more passwords. In the end, she just ended up storing the same password for everything, which is not a great thing to do. And another thing was each service had to take care of the user credentials, and that should be done with proper security. Also, the complexity of the security or the tightness of the security would depend a lot on the resources that the services. So we had mainly three needs. The service needs all the services need a common agency which can handle the user creds and implement proper security, and they would completely handle the authentication term which we would look into later. Need 2 was a protocol by which the common agency would be able to talk to the services and provide the required service. Need 3 was the ability to provide only the required information and not everything, depending upon the user consent. So today we have single sign-on. If you want to log into a page, you get something like this. So you have login with Google, GitHub, and Facebook. So these are our common agencies which we discussed. And yes, so we have a variety of agency which we can choose from. So before moving on to more technical terms, we'll just get an overview of what each terms are. So the first thing is the difference between authentication and authorization. So authentication basically means you are who you claim to be. That when you provide some user credentials, the service will know that, okay, this is the person who is the owner of these user credentials. Now, that is what is meant by authentication. So authorization means that you need to prove that a user has given consent to a service to access specific part of your resource with specific permissions. So those are the difference between authentication and authorization. Let's look into some participants in the authentication group. First, you have the user agent, which is your browser who is trying to access an app or service. Then you have the identity provider, which is Google, GitHub, and Facebook in this case. Then we have the relying parties, which is the app or service which relies on the identity provider. In this case, it is Stack. Now about participants in the authorization flow, you have the resource owner, who is the owner of the resource. Suppose you install an app, let's say WhatsApp, and WhatsApp requires access to all your contacts. So, and the contacts, the person who is owning the resources, the contacts will be the resources, and the person who is owning those resources, such as you are the resource owner. And there would be an authorization server, which is the app that deals with the authorization. The resource server in this case would be your contacts, and client would be the app which is requiring data access. So in the example I said, it would be WhatsApp. Now let's look into Auth 2.0. So Auth 2.0 is, broadly speaking, an authorization protocol. It was invented to solve the problem of delegated authorization, which is the same thing I said earlier about WhatsApp asking permission from the contacts app to get access to a particular part of the resource and so on. And it also forms a basis for OpenID Connect, a protocol for authentication. So how does it work? Let's just look at the diagram and I'll explain that. So suppose we have a client, yelp.com, and it needs authorization to access contacts from contacts.google.com. So it goes to the authorization server, which in this case is accounts.google.com. It'll pass a message telling about the scope, and it'll pass redirect URIs. The scope, which is profile and contacts, is what Yelp.com or the client needs to access. Now the authorization server would ask you, a pop-up box would show asking the user content. Okay, so do we allow Yelp to access this particular scope from this particular resources? So we can give yes or no. If we give yes, it will redirect back to the redirect URL along with an authorization code. So the authorization code is passed by Yelp back to the authorization in return for an access token. Now the access token is again sent to contacts.google.api, and the contacts.google.com would check if the access token is valid and then permit Yelp.com to access a particular resource. Now, if you see, the solid lines would represent an implicit flow and the dotted lines represent an authorization flow. The basic difference is that the dotted lines are more secure than the others. So for access token, we need to have extremely secure direct connection so that there would not be any network attackers um, just stealing away the access token and using it for malicious purposes. So that's the overview of Auth 2.0. So Auth 2.0 was a very good protocol for uh, authorization, but people started using it for authentication. But it had a lot of problems. So why is that? There was no standard. Therefore, each app had its own implementation. There was no interoperability. There were no common scopes, and they did not really care about the identity specifically. Now we come to OpenID Connect, which is the standard implementation of a layer above Auth 2.2. The changes simply are there would be an additional ID token, there would be a user info endpoint for getting user info, there would be a standard set of scopes, and the standard implementation. So this is the flow of OpenID Connect. There would be a line party, user agent, and identity protocol. The user agent would initiate the protocol by asking to log in. The line party would send the client ID and the nonce, which would again be passed to the identity provider. The identity provider would ask for user consent. The user agent would give consent, and the identity token would be returned. The identity token would again be sent to the line party. It would be validated, and login would be confirmed. So, so far so well, but it has two problems. Now we are looking into privacy, right? Now I should tell that we are not looking into the network attack point of perspective, but with respect to the identity provider and the relying parties. So here the main two problems are login linkability with respect to colluding RPs, which means and login linkability with respect to identity providers. So colluding RPs means that suppose you log into two different relying parties with the same client ID. You usually the client ID, the subject ID is usually fixed, and you use it to log into two different RPs. Now, if those RPs are communicating with each other, they would know that this account belongs to the same user from your subject ID, and they can exchange information and do something malicious. Now, this is solved by a part of the standard implementation of um, OpenID Connect, which uses a pairwise subject ID, which basically means that the client ID is not fixed and there would be a different client ID generated for different IPs. So that is login linkability with respect to colluding IPs. The second problem is login linkability with respect to identity providers. See here, we depend too much on the identity provider. If it's Google, we just depend on Google or Facebook to handle all our data. So Google or Facebook would know that to which site you are logging in, the frequency of your logging in, and they can use this data for not so good purposes. But big companies would have a high reputation, so they won't do anything malicious, but they can still use your data for advertising purposes. So this requires immense trust on identity providers to keep your data safely and not use it for their own purpose. So coming to the model we discussed in the paper, which is privacy preserving OpenID Connect. So as discussed previously, there is something called a client ID. So the client ID would identify the relying party. So suppose you are logging into Stack Overflow using Global, there would be a separate client ID for Stack Overflow of another service, say for example, of a hospital website and so on. So here the client ID is used for two main purposes. One is to look up the client when asking the client to log in, and remember the response form asking for consent. So the identity provider would use the client ID to look up as to which RP is asking the consent and displaying the dialog box accordingly. The second one is to get the set of redirect URIs corresponding to the line party. Now, the basic idea is that the identity provider gets info about the relying parties or the services we log in via the client ID. So, why not reveal it? But how would we preserve the function? So, we preserve the functionality by masking the client ID and using hashes, and using that we use it for communication with identity provider. And all calculations would be performed by the user agent, which is our browser. So let's look into how we exchange the tokens with the masked ID. So the line party would generate something called RP nonce. It would send the client ID and RP nonce to the user agent. The user agent would generate a new nonce and combine it together to create a hash. The hash is then sent over to the identity provider, which generates a unique token for each hash it gets. And this token is sent back, and yeah, it finally reaches the line party. The line party would again compute the hash with the client ID, the RP nonce which it has, and the U nonce which is supplied by the user agent. Now, if the calculated hash and the hash supplied by the user agent matches, it authenticates. So here we mask the client ID, but how would the identity provider know that I'm not giving a token to a wrong relying party? So for that, the relying party would have to need to register initially with the identity provider. So the identity provider would provide some data for registration, and the identity provider would sign it and give it back. The data would include the client ID, client name, and a set of redirect URLs of RPs, and it would be signed by the IDP private key and returned. Now, this would be called as the client binding. Now, putting both of them together, let's look into the overview of the protocol. So first, the user agent initiates the protocol. The RP sends the client ID binding and the RP nonce. The user agent would request the identity provider for the public key, and the public key is returned. Now the client ID binding is validated using the public key provided by the identity provider. So we'll get the client ID, and the hash is calculated using client ID, RP nonce, and U nonce. Now the masked art would be sent to the identity provider, and the private ID token would be returned. The user agent would then forward the private ID token and UNONs, and then recompute the hash from client ID, RP nonce, and UNONs, and it would validate the private ID token. Now, once it's done validation, you would be logged in. So that is about the privacy preserving OpenID Connect. So here the dependency on identity provider is completely remote. However, login unlinkability with respect to colluding RPs is not achieved. So for that, we would have to work on more. So that is pairwise privacy preserving OpenID Connect. So in pairwise OpenID Connect, the information of the user is present in ID token given by IDP. This login unlinkability with respect to colluding IDPs is not achieved. Here in pairwise, this is achieved. However, login unlinkability with respect to identity provider is compromised. So these are our goals mainly. First is login unlinkability with respect to identity provider, login unlinkability with respect to colluding RPs, and security with respect to Adobe Yahoo network attacker. So these are our requirements and goals. So the first one is user agent computable identifiers. So that would provide unlinkability with respect to the identity provider. It just means that the user agent must be able to compute the pairwise identifier for the user at a specific RP, because the identity provider does not know which RP the user wishes to log in. Now the second one is there should be no identifier registration. So the pairwise identifiers need not the RP, that is the RP need not register initially to the identity provider because the identity provider is not used at all. Then pairwise identifier and linkability, which is what we talked about, the colluding RP. So two RPs should not be able to communicate each other from the information extracted. And identity provider hidden identifiers, which is while the pairwise identifier must be persistent, the identity provider must not be able to link protocol runs where the user uses the same pairwise identifier. Now the last one is user-bound identifiers, which is the identity provider must only sign an ID token, which it knows is valid, is from a valid user agent. It should not be a malicious user. So these are our goals. So putting it all together, this is the workflow overview of the pairwise privacy preserving OpenID Connect. So initially there would be an RP, user agent, and ID provider. The user agent would initiate the protocol. The client ID binding and RP nonce is sent back to the user agent. As before, it would request ID provider for a user ID and private key. Now the client ID binding is validated. User consent is received. The hash values are calculated. So the first hash will be the client ID, RP nonce, and U nonce. Now the second one is the pairwise subject ID. That is calculated by using hash of user ID and the client ID. Now the masked subject would be hash of pairwise subject ID and U nonce too. Now all of those is sent together as masked odd and masked sub to identity provider. Now in step 8, the identity provider would calculate using a zero knowledge proof to see that the user ID is indeed in that hash for some x and y. And after verifying that, the private ID token is returned, and the private ID token pairwise sub and unons2 is sent back to RP. Now this is recomputed at RP point as hash of client ID, RP nonce, and unons, hash of pairwise subject ID, and it's basically validated, and the login is confirmed. The user will be logged in as pairwise, using the pairwise subject ID. So going to the conclusion, we went through authentication and authorization protocols. We learned how existing protocols may compromise privacy of user, and we also looked into a model which implemented security and privacy protection. So these are the reference papers which I referred while studying the subject, and yeah, that's all. Thank you.